Good morning. We're continuing this week on the second half of Jesus' sermon we picked up on last week. We looked at the section of Jesus' sermon in Luke on loving your enemies, and this week we're talking about judging others. And one of the things that I don't know that you all are aware of, but I actually plan sermons like way ahead of time. Like I actually planned these 2 weeks of sermons back last August. And so I try and plan out 6 to 9 months ahead of time. And so I was planning it. And one of the things I did last summer was I actually went to some folks on Facebook and I said, what would you like to hear? If you were to come to church, what would be important for you to hear sermons on, topics on, preached on? And people actually gave me responses. It was great. I got a lot of response. And one of the responses, someone sent me this quote, this famous quote from Gandhi. And Gandhi's quote says this: I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ. I thought about that, and and I've heard that quote before, and actually that was the quote that kind of was the basis of this 2 weeks series on loving others, and this week about being a generous in spirit rather than critical of spirit. And when I think about that, I think part of that is because, Gandhi, what challenges me and what I like about this quote is Gandhi is challenging me as a Christian to be more like Christ. That quote challenges me to say I need to bring my life more in line with the one that I follow, with the person that I am claiming to follow. So when I say I'm a Christian, I'm saying I follow this person. This is the person I'm following. And so my life should more and more exemplify that one that I am following. And so that quote challenges me. Now, if I'm honest with you, I also don't like that quote because I think it's an unfair expectation for me. Because really the comparison is you're going to compare me to Christ. That's a no-win situation for me. Does that make sense? Because I'm not perfect like Christ is perfect. I don't have it all together like Christ had it all together. And even as I hear these words of the sermon, I wish I could stand before you today and say, I've got all these figured out. So in some ways, I feel like it's an unfair expectation or an unfair comparison. And yet at the same time, it challenges me to be more like Christ. So there's both of those things. But the thing that I think that helps us get our minds around that is I was actually talking to a friend who was Pentecostal, and he said it a little bit differently. But we were talking about the behavior of this person, and this person was not acting appropriately as a Christian would, and we were in a sense judging their actions. And in the conversation, my Pentecostal friend said this. He said, "Remember, they haven't been saved that long." I think that's a good way of putting it, right? Basically, what my friend was saying was, remember, this person's only been following Christ for a year. How can we expect this person to be like Christ if they've only been doing it for a year? How long does it take to figure out how to be like Christ? A lifetime, right. Yet when we judge and condemn others, when we criticize others about their relationship with God or relationship with Christ or the behavior, we have to keep in mind that person is in process. That person has not arrived yet. That person God is still working in their lives and working through them and in them. And we're all in process. Amen? We're all on that journey. We're all in that place. None of us have arrived. And that's the one thing that ordinary saints understand. Ordinary saints understand that we're not perfect, but we follow one who is. Ordinary saints understand that they're frail, make failure, they fall, they fumble. They're unfaithful sometimes. They make mistakes. They have imperfections. They freak out. They're not always forgiving. And yet we follow one who is forgiving. We follow one who is faultless. We follow one who is fruitful. And we follow one who is faithful. And that's what we're attempting to do. Imperfect people trying to follow a perfect Christ. We're ordinary saints. We don't always get it. And so Jesus actually points out some of the things that make us realize that we're not perfect. Actually, I love this quote from Ben Franklin, who said, "Any fool can criticize, condemn, and complain, and most fools do." Jesus says, that's not the nature of an ordinary saint to go around criticizing, condemning. That's not what ordinary saints do. Ordinary saints realize that they have logs in their eyes. Jesus actually uses this analogy. How do we go around taking the specks out of other people's eye when we have this log in our own eye? And Jesus does that, but there's something about us. In fact, last night in worship, we were Saturday night worship, there was a typo in up on the slides during the worship service. And then when I got up to preach, it was like, I can't even ask for better material than this, right? So I get up to preach and I say, how many people noticed the typo last night? The typo on the screen. Most of the hands went up. Everybody knew the typo. There's something within us that can see the speck. Now, 99% of the other words were perfectly fine. And we worship just fine with the typo. But there's something within us that wants to point out the typo. Now, here's a question. How much does that matter? Is anybody's life going to be changed if I point out a typo in a worship slide? No. It doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter that much. It's not going to change anybody's life. Now, do we want to change the typo or correct it? Of course. But pointing out the typo is about something about us. It says something about our spirit. And there's a part of us that always wants to point out the one little thing and ignore the big thing within us, the log within our own lives. And we all have them, right? We all have the logs. And so this is actually Jesus. If you didn't know this, Jesus is making a joke. I mean, get the image. This is actually a humorous image. If you can imagine people with literally think about it, people with logs in their eyes going around trying to take the specks out of other people's eyes. That is a humorous illustration to look at, to think about it. It'd make a great skit on Saturday Night Live. So Jesus is actually being humorous when he says this, and he's basically saying we do that. So I've learned a few lessons being married and about specks and logs. And I probably got dozens of examples of my speck pointing out. There are certain things you just don't do when your wife buys new shoes. There are certain things you don't do or say when new clothing is purchased. So those types of things. But here's the thing. When my wife comes to me and says to me, I've got something in my eye. Can you help me get it out? That's a different place, isn't it? That's a different place to be. When I am asked to participate or to help remove the speck, that's a whole different situation than when I'm pointing out something. You see what I'm saying? So when I'm pointing out what comes out, other stuff. But when I'm invited to participate in the speck removal, then it's a different scenario. I think it's the same with so it's not even about the specks, it's about the logs. And we all have a log. All of us carry a log somewhere. And it's interesting that when we'll invite others to help us with the log, it actually goes a lot better, doesn't it? And I think about that, recovery groups. Recovery groups are a great example of logs. People bring their logs to the group, something they're struggling with, and they say, I've got this log. But who are they coming to help remove the log? Somebody else who has experienced that same log or who has experienced removing the log. And so we go to people who actually have experience with log removal, whatever our log is. Does that make sense? And that's also different, isn't it? Because when we want people who know how to remove logs to help us remove our log. We don't want somebody else pointing out our log or helping us to remove our log that doesn't have any experience doing that. And it makes a difference, doesn't it, how that scenario goes. And so to invite people into helping us is very important. And that's what a lot of recovery ministry does. And that's how logs get removed from our lives, is because we invite others into that process, and we invite those who know what it's like to have that log because they share that experience with us. The other thing about this is Jesus is saying ordinary saints also have a spirit in which they measure people differently or measure things differently. And so an example of this is I had a professor in school, and first-year professor, came in, he was ready to just instill everything that he had into us as his students. He was very rigid and very hard on his students. And, at first you think, well, it's for our own good. And I'll never forget one day when he blew up in class. I mean, he blew up because we weren't doing it the right way. And he became overly critical of some people in our class. Fortunately, it wasn't me, but there were some others in our class that weren't doing it the right way. And so they became very critical of the class. And I remember him pounding his fist, and I remember him yelling at our class about how we weren't doing it the right way. So since he was a first-year professor, at the end of the term, the administration asked all his students to fill out an evaluation of his teaching. How do you think that went? Not too good. In fact, the evaluations that came back from the class actually put him on the defensive, and actually he would not talk to many of our class members because of that experience. But the point is, with what you measure out, Jesus says, is the measure you get back. Jesus says, whatever you give to others, guess what you get back from others? So if we have a critical spirit and we're giving a critical spirit to others, what do you think we get back? And if we have a generous spirit and we give to others, what do you think we get back? To kind of bring that home a little bit more, I brought a 5-gallon bucket with me. And Jesus is actually using this idea. In the first century, people would go and they would give away grain. They would give somebody grain. And so to give grain, they would go and they would actually put it in the lap of the person. So they would wear garments. And if you can imagine, maybe even a person wearing an apron or some outer garment that was loose. And so they would come to the person because they didn't have, we didn't have, all these kitchen things that we have today back in the first century. So they would come to get their grain, and that the person who had the grain bin would measure out the grain in a container. And then they would pour that into the lap of the person or the garment of the person receiving the grain. So if you used a big container to scoop up the grain, you got a lot of grain in your lap. If you used a little container to scoop up the grain, you got a little grain in your lap. And Jesus is actually saying, not only do you get the way it is, but you get the grain and then they pack it down tightly and they put more grain in it. You never been to an ice cream shop, where they you're going to get a single scoop and then you get the ice cream cone back and it's like you thought what is a single scoop was really like a triple scoop. You know what I'm talking about? That's what Jesus is talking about. If we're generous in our spirit, not just generous with our giving, but generous in our spirit, we're going to get that kind of experience. And that's what's happening with that grain illustration. It's packed down. It's more than you would expect. So you get more than you would expect when you're generous. Now, if we're critical of spirit, we also might get more than we expect. So if I can use a 5-gallon bucket to be generous, or I can use a thimble. Now, if I'm being generous of spirit, which container would you like me to use to measure my generosity? The bucket, right? Yeah, pretty obvious. If I'm being critical of spirit, which measuring device would you like me to use? The thimble, or neither, right? But if you give me a little dose, don't dump the whole load on me if you're going to be critical. But if you're going to be generous, dump the whole load, not just a little bit. And so that's just an extreme analogy, but that's what Jesus is saying, that this is a spirit issue. This is a generosity of spirit or critical of spirit. Judging others, condemning others, the measure with which we use to judge and others and criticize and evaluate others, and the measure we use is independent on is dependent upon how we're received as well. Which measure do you think God uses when God is being loving and generous? Which one do you think God wants to use? The bucket, right? And ordinary saints understand that they measure out God's generosity and God's love to others. And so ordinary saints understand that they want to carry around the buckets of God's grace and God's generosity with them rather than the thimbles of God's grace and generosity. And there's a difference, isn't it? I mean, we know when we've encountered somebody that's working out of this and working out of this. And that's the other thing. It's interesting because Jesus said here in this sermon, he said we're not to judge or condemn or be judgmental, yet in this sermon he actually says we are to evaluate fruit. And we're supposed to look at the fruit of people's lives. We're supposed to look at what the fruit of a person's life is coming out. Because really he's talking about, you guys can follow me and look at the fruit of my life and choose to follow me, or you can follow these other leaders or these other teachers. And he calls them, can a blind man follow another blind man? Or are you going to follow the blind guides? Or are you going to follow the one who does have sight and can teach you and lead you to the good fruit in your life? And so that's what Jesus is talking about. And so he's saying, even though we're not supposed to judge, we are supposed to evaluate the fruit of someone's life. So to take this a little bit further, if there's good within a person, what's going to come out? Good fruit. So here's the thing, when we judge and criticize others, we're making assumptions or drawing conclusions about what we think is inside a person. We're drawing a conclusion and making an assumption about what we think is in their heart. And Jesus says, you and I can't see in anybody's heart. I don't know about you. I'm not a mind reader or a heart reader. I can't do that. The only thing that Jesus is saying that we can evaluate or look at is the fruit that comes out of a person's heart or the fruit that comes out of a person's life. And that says something about a person. So it's whatever's inside of a person is the fruit that comes out. And so that's important to evaluate, Jesus said. And so Jesus says, you and I want to follow people who bring good fruit into their life, into our life and into the world's life. And to look for people who are bearing good fruit. And to spend time with those people and be around those people and follow those people. Jesus is also saying that if that fruit is not there, you might want to avoid those people. Psychologists sometimes refer to people that are critical, use a bucket for their critical side. They refer to people as toxic people. You know what I'm talking about? They're toxic. Why are they toxic? They're toxic because what happens if I hang around with a person who's got a bucket full of criticism they're carrying around, and I spend a lot more time with them, what happens to my bucket that I carry? Some of their stuff in their bucket gets over into my bucket. And so I need to hang out with people who have big buckets like Jesus and carry around that good stuff and the good fruit, because if I hang out with those folks and they're carrying that bucket, what do they put into my bucket? The good fruit, right? The good stuff. And so Jesus is saying there's some wisdom in who we spend time with and who we pay attention to in our lives. And ordinary saints are people who look for good fruit in their lives and in the lives of other people and the lives of the one that they follow, and that's Christ. So they understand that. So I want to ask the question again. What do you think God looks for? What is God evaluating us on? Is God evaluating us on perfection? On being perfect? Or is God looking at us as people who are in process? As people who are trying to follow Christ? So I hope God's looking at my life, and not only, as I'm pointing my life towards Christ, but I hope God is looking at Matt and going, Matt, you're doing a whole lot better than you did 20 years ago, bud. You're doing a good job. Keep it up. I hope God's saying that. I hope God's looking at me that way. Rather than God's coming to me and saying, you just don't get it, do you? Does God come to me with a laundry list of things? I hope not. My track coach, many years ago, I was back in high school. I ran track, and they divided us up into long distance and sprinters, and I was kind of in the middle, but I ended up on the sprint side of things on the track team. And I ran one of the relays for the track team and as a sprinter, and I was 160 pounds back then and the same height I am today. So I was just like a beanpole. And so I was sprinting, and the coach would train us in track practice, and he would say, now look, when you're running a race, don't ever look back. Never turn your head when you're in a race. You stay focused on the finish line. Because the moment you turn your head in competition, you'll lose ground. You'll lose momentum. You'll lose sight of the finish line. And if you watch the Olympics, when the Olympics come, you'll watch track field, you'll notice all those runners, they stay focused straight ahead. If you ever see a runner look over their shoulder to see where they are or compare themselves to the other runners, you'll notice they lose ground. They lose, as soon as they do it, it's like, they're going to lose. They're going to lose. Because as soon as they start comparing themselves to the other racers, that's the moment they start to lose ground. I think about that. That's really what we're talking about, is there is so much for me to focus on as an individual to be more like Christ. I don't have time to look at the others around me and judge what they're doing or how they're doing in their relationship to Christ. Jesus is saying the moment we do that, we lose sight of being like Christ. The moment we turn our heads and judge others or criticize others about their life or their spirituality or whatever is the moment we lose sight of Christ and being like Christ. Remember Peter? Got out of a boat. He did a pretty good job of walking on water until he did what? He looked back. He looked to the side. He took his eyes off of Christ. You see, there's so much for us. I got enough work for me to do. I've got enough things in my life to work on that I don't have time to work on other people's lives because I've got to become like Christ. And if I want others to see Christ in me, who do you think needs to be in my bucket? Christ. Christ needs to be in my bucket. Christ needs to be in my heart. And that's the way others will see the fruit of Christ in me. Amen.